Thank you so much for that warm welcome and that lovely introduction. It's brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. So thank you especially to my cherished colleagues and students and former students, and to my friends and family. Lots and lots of you here tonight. It's lovely to see. All of my achievements are enriched and enabled by your support. And as I talk through my projects and my preoccupations tonight, I'm speaking in the first person, but I do all of my research in a community that extends inside and outside the Academy and across Brighton and beyond. So genuinely, I owe you all so much, truly. I was told by a colleague that it is customary for professors to start their inaugural lectures with a photograph of themselves as a child, a family photo that shows where it all began. I'm going to turn that convention around a little, and I'm going to begin with strangers' family photos. For much of my career has been concerned with looking at other people's photographs. My scholarly journey began with examples a bit like these. Photos that end up as orphaned objects in car boot sales and junk shops, cut adrift from their origins, and with the names of their takers and sitters mostly unrecorded or no longer remembered, and which find new owners to bring new narratives for perhaps 50p a time. And around 25 years ago, I began noticing the prevalence of these objects in the second-hand market. And one of my earliest projects investigated 5 interwar photograph albums bought from a house clearance dealer. I followed the vicissitudes of those albums as they moved from a treasured possession to a discarded item. Through research into photographic guidance and camera technology, I examined histories of photography through birth certificates and marriage registers, through street directories and census records. I researched the history of the photographer. And that took me from an anonymous person without fame or fortune to the upper echelons of the aristocracy. I located descendants, and I discovered divorce and disinheritance, adultery and abandonment. In my romantic attempts to restore albums to owners, I discovered the secrets and lies of the form. And that exercise was very instructive for me. I learned that objects are often cast out for a reason, and that images tell selective stories. How objects and images can be used to narrate identities was a key part of that project, which also examined what happens when those narratives are lost, forgotten, revised, or contradicted. And as personal photos are perhaps the most peopled of all objects, I became invested in object biographies, an anthropological concept that considers material goods as if they were people, with births, careers, deaths, and afterlives. Photos in their print format are 3-dimensional objects that move through space and time, and they are things with which a range of practices are done, including displaying and hiding, keeping and discarding, remembering and forgetting. And these approaches are now core to how I work with visual and material culture, whether I consider greetings cards or second-hand clothes, whether they're made and used by unknowns or by celebrated names, and whether the material is rescued from the rubbish dump or consulted in hallowed museums. So my lecture tonight will show you how I think with things as I tell you my own object biography. It's a commonplace now to say that we live in image-saturated times. Dizzying statistics circulate about the scale of photographic production in an age of smartphones and social media. These count photos by the trillion. Commentators frequently note the unprecedented character of our current photographic condition, and artists have attempted to visualize this abundance. So Eric Kessels, for example, in his installation 24 Hours in Photos, prints off 1 million or so submissions from the larger quantities uploaded to image sharing platforms every day to visualize this pictorial tidal wave. And these discourses of image overwhelm suggest a culture of profusion and confusion, a kind of visual noise. And they suggest to an excess of banality, sometimes unfathomable in its enormity. So many photographic critics, as well as photographic journalists, as well as popular journalists, concerned about the massification of digital imagery, ask if the world needs to see 1 trillion sunsets, 1 trillion photos of people's lunch, 1 trillion photos of their cats. And I became interested in these discussions because I spent many years examining the prehistory of these practices. So I did some fathoming for my PhD. And specifically, I analysed photos like this, submitted to a mass participation photographic event in 1987, where everyone in Britain was asked to take a photograph of everyday life on the 14th of August. And that project, One Day for Life, generated around 50,000 submissions, and its subject matter was precisely sunsets, lunch, and pets. So the organisers staged that event to raise charitable funds. So every submission was accompanied by a £1 donation. And it was also staged as a competition. So around 1% of those submitted appeared in a commemorative book, which topped the bestseller lists for Christmas 1987. But it was also styled as participatory history, and it was a resource that was said to be of use to historians of the future. I was that historian, but when I encountered it about 20 years after its making, it was under the historical radar. At the close of One Day for Life, no photography museum wanted its 50,000 mostly blurred and out-of-focus snaps. It only found a home thanks to Dorothy Sheridan, then director of the Mass Observation Archive, a repository that specialises in amateur accounts of everyday life in Britain. And Sheridan was well known for rescuing material out of skips and for accepting what other institutions rejected. So to make sense of this material, I collected the stories and expectations attached to the photos by surveying around 130 participants, organisers, judges, and publishers. In questionnaires and interviews, I asked them to look back at photos taken decades before, drawing on the temporal capacity of photographs to simultaneously evoke the there then and the here now. This condition has been described as deictic, meaning photos differ in meaning depending on when they are apprehended. And that study led me to some key concepts that now underpin my thinking. That photos, despite being referred to as stills, are always in motion. They anticipate future reflection at the moment they are taken, and the past that they contain is always revised through the prism of the present. As they flow through time, never experienced in the same way twice, photographs lend themselves to autobiographical meaning-making, and those stories frequently exceed what a photograph can show. And for reasons of time, I'm going to offer you just one example. From 50,000 options, I've selected a photo of a kitten. And this is partly because the photography of cats has come to represent triviality in the age of the internet. The popularity of cats is sometimes used to signal the lowest common denominator of online communication, or the limits of imagination in the face of infinite possibility. And the phenomenon of the online cat photo is so significant, it's formed the basis of substantial exhibitions at London's Photographers Gallery and New York's Museum of the Moving Image. Among the 50,000 photos of One Day for Life, all kinds of cats were photographed from all kinds of angles. And as a form of meta-commentary, there are even photos of cats being photographed. Stella Skingle was one example of a participant who took one of those cat photos. And as revealed in interview, she was typical of many entrants in that she never took part in photography competitions. She used her simple point-and-shoot camera only for family events. The cancer fundraising aspect of the project attracted her, and she submitted photographs of her teenage daughter, who was recovering from chemotherapy and had lost her hair. Skingle also submitted a photo of the kitten that she had given her daughter for comfort during her illness, and that was the photo selected for inclusion in the publication by the editors for reasons of the creature's visual appeal alone. None of its wider purpose was visible. For Skingle, however, the photo was deeply enmeshed in her family's experience of cancer. It was more than a cute picture to sell a coffee table book, and it could not be reduced to a visual cliché. So the participants that I surveyed had passionate, personal, and sometimes political reasons for taking their photos, but they submitted pictures of kittens, sunsets, vases of flowers, and thatched cottages in droves. They used the available means of a popular image repertoire to communicate their messages, which mapped onto the project's wider frameworks of ordinary people, of everyday life in Britain, of illness and grief, and of historical commemoration. What the photo was for, and what it was expected to do, shaped its meaning beyond its subject content. Skingle's kitten is a distinctive story, but it shows that there's no reason to assume that other amateur photos in the archive are merely pictorial clichés that collectively constitute visual noise. Each has a unique meaning to its maker. So by the same token, there is no reason to assume that other amateur photos en masse are pictorial clichés or visual noise. No matter how many there are, each has a meaning and a purpose. Critics of our abundant image condition assert that we have never had so many photos to scrutinise, but they complain that we are lost in an impenetrable jungle. I counter to continue that metaphor that those looking at the woods cannot see the trees. We need to look closely rather than at a distance. So I argued in some publications that emerged from that research that an unexpected afterlife for large-scale analogue archives is they offer tools for understanding large-scale digital photography. But after these were published, the research then had another afterlife. As the COVID pandemic took hold in spring 2020, crowdsourced photography projects emerged in force as a way to create connections between communities, to record a historical moment characterised as unprecedented, and to externalise the complex emotions that these circumstances precipitated. In recognition of widespread camera ownership in smartphones and the potential for networked images to bridge the isolation caused by stay-at-home regulations, COVID photo projects seem to offer accessible routes for collective record making. And for me, these projects had remarkable resonances with pre-COVID endeavours. And organisations wanting to make sense of their submissions reached out for interpreters. And that was how I came to be commissioned by Historic England, the state-funded body tasked with caring for the historic national environment, to analyse picturing lockdown. This public engagement project took place over a week in April 2020. Their call to depict lockdown daily life generated 3,000 photos of the home haircuts, home baking, rainbows in windows, and clapping for carers that characterised early lockdown. The project's ambition to create a unique time capsule was very like other events I had researched, where its ultimate value is often deferred for future historians to decide. Looking at those photos close to the point of production, however, reveals that whatever else they may be evidence of in the future, they are a record of a desire to record. Analysis of picturing lockdown submissions showed that the participating public experienced lockdown, showed how they experienced lockdown, but also subtly different, how they thought that experience was best communicated visually. Some photos in picturing lockdown spelled out an effective purpose. They spelled it out visually, and others did so through titles or descriptions. And together I argued that the photos and accompanying text aimed to show not only what lockdown looked like, but also what it felt like. A notable proportion of submissions were of subjects from sunsets to pets that did not seem immediately connected to a global pandemic. And those photographs were not foregrounded by those putting a public face to the project, but I argued for their importance, for rejects are just as historically valuable as those who win the game. And by their submission to Picturing Lockdown, all submissions were about COVID, regardless of how they looked. They were all photographs of COVID experience. Their significance was often extra pictorial. It lay outside the frame. It was what the photos were about, even if it was not what they were of. So parts of my interest in researching histories of popular photography has been to try to understand how our present-day practices have been shaped. How did we come to understand what subjects were consequential and what styles were good, in inverted commas? What structures and systems inculcated those values? And I'm showing you here an example of a photo that's been subject to the judgment of a photo processor. And it is also a witty commentary, as it is a submission to a photo competition. So to answer some of those questions may require you to go looking under your beds or on top of your wardrobes, where, if you're of a certain age, you might encounter scenes such as this: paper wallets full of prints and negatives processed by high street or mail order film services. This example is by Wendy Aldis as part of a 2020 photo book project where she documented every item in her father's house after his death. Her father was the science fiction writer Brian Aldiss. Personal photos are often described as people's most treasured possessions, the material they are most likely to save from a burning house. I do not dispute this, but I want to argue, perhaps perversely, that the wallets that the photos come in are also of cultural value. So for around 100 years, photo processors' print wallets communicated ideals and promoted products. They provided advice and they modelled behaviour. Their striking graphic styles and advertising messages show the world of technologies, companies and services that underpinned popular photography, and they offer us an alternative history of the form. Rich with imagery, mostly by anonymous illustrators and photographers, and with texts that convey expectations and sustain social norms, they communicate in confined spaces with a striking economy of means. They show what subjects were considered photographable, and they reinforce prohibitions by what they omit. They map growing camera ownership in Britain, and they chart the decline of film as a mass form. In the book I wrote on the topic, I used 100 examples to plot a century of change. All are from my own collection of perhaps 1,000, built up over a decade of rummaging at car boot sales. I rarely spend more than £1, and many are given to me for free by house clearance dealers. They are battered, bruised, well thumbed and scribbled on. Although the definition of printed ephemera is that they are the minor transient documents of everyday life, these examples endure. As some photography specialists in the audience will well know, for photography's first 50 years, from the 1830s to the 1880s, processes were complex and technology was cumbersome. The practice was the preserve of the few. This changed in the late 1880s when the US company Kodak developed affordable roll film cameras that could be operated with a few simple actions. Kodak's catchphrase was, "You press the button and we do the rest," meaning that those without time, space, or interest in developing could participate. As camera ownership grew at the start of the 20th century, commercial developing and printing services appeared widely. In 1908, Kodak created what it called a neat double envelope to return customers' prints and negatives. Typically, these envelopes were printed with brief instructions about technique and advertisements for products. And they almost always featured an illustration, often of a woman or a girl with a camera. Kodak's been credited with not only inventing snapshot photography, but also with creating the culture that surrounds it. Kodak marketed simple push-button photography to women especially. The so-called Kodak girls that they used as brand characters were female photographers in action, as well as attractive models offering branded products for sale. Kodak girls were young, white, elegant and fashionable, wearing their cameras as accessories. They appeared in blue and white striped dresses with changing hairstyles and hemlines in Kodak advertising for over 50 years. And I'll show you some examples. These are some from the 1930s, some from the 1950s, one with an Instamatic camera from the mid-1960s. So the photo wallets show not only what a photographer with a simple camera should look like, but also a century of suitable subjects. Smiling, universally white-skinned nuclear families and heterosexual couples, ubiquitous sunny days and beach holidays, adorable infants and cute pets. Photo wallets showed only what goes on in front of the lens and not the labour behind the scenes. Scholars of visual culture must always consider what is invisible, or perhaps more accurately, invisibilised. Push-button photography and commercial print services were not only aimed at women users, but women workers often did the factory work, as illustrated in this press photo from Kodak's Harrow premises in the 1930s, which was by then processing 4 million prints a year. As camera ownership expanded through the 20th century, so did photographic quantities. In 1976, then Britain's hottest summer, holiday snaps grew like never before. The workers who produced them, however, toiled in windowless buildings without air conditioning, where overtime was compulsory. In the Grunwick photo processing lab in Willesden, northwest London, the long hours and the low pay suffered by the majority women, 80% Asian and 10% Afro-Caribbean workers who made up the 440 employees came to a head with a mass walkout. The 2-year strike is well known in British labour history. It highlighted the poor treatment of migrant workers, trade union picket tactics and police brutality. But what is not so well remembered is that cheap mail-order photo processing was at its heart. And it's a bitter irony that the photos processed by exploited Black and South Asian women who could not take time off for doctor's appointments when pregnant, and by mothers who could not maintain regular hours to attend to their children's needs, were enveloped in fantasy depictions of harmonious white families at leisure. Mail-order brands circulated promotional envelopes for film processing services on an enormous scale. They offered free films, free duplicate prints, and free postage, but their labourers paid the price. This story is 50 years old, but we live with the afterlives of these historical erasures. They produce the gaps and the silences in the archives. So quite a few of my projects have involved looking at those who have been overlooked, whether amateur cultural producers or image labourers, those who have been subject to the condescension of posterity, as the historian E.P. Thompson styled it, those whose practices are considered too minor to have been given a place in the archive. And I also enjoy researching materials undervalued in art history, the unruly and the unwieldy. Together, these seem to constitute a conscious set of principles and methods for why I do what I do, but I want to say that a lot of my research has actually begun under conditions of serendipity. And if my projects offer a kind of biography, this is certainly true for the research I will outline next. In 2011, I took my daughter to Woodcraft Folk, which offers outdoor after-school activities and gives children a voice in how the organisation is run. I did not bring my academic faculties with me until I heard its creed or promise, which mentioned hating war, loving fellowship, and fashioning a new world. So this is woodcraft folk now. I asked about their history, and I found that it had its origins in a radical organisation, as a radical organisation for workers' children. It had formed as a splinter group of a mystical utopian organisation, the Kindred of the Kibbo Kift, who had visionary plans to reconfigure all aspects of 1920s Britain, from education to economics, through an idiosyncratic blend of camping, hiking, and handicrafts. And that was a chance encounter that led to major research activity, including a book and an exhibition at Whitechapel Gallery, and a series of articles and talks that haven't stopped more than a decade on. So I naturally began my research by reading the only book written about Kibbo Kift, but I was frustrated to find that it contained not a single image. For me, the sight of members arrayed in strange garments, cut in robotic shapes, featuring cryptic symbolism, combining elements of the Bauhaus Ballet with the British Boy Scouts, formed the basis for my intrigue. And the visual image too was central to the organisation's purpose. So Kibbo Kift's founder, John Hargrave, was a professional artist, knowledgeable about the European avant-garde and employed in the advertising industry. Kibbo Kift's photographer was a young Angus MacBain, many years before he became celebrated for his dramatic portraits of Audrey Hepburn and Vivien Leigh and other stars of stage and screen. The organisation was packed with creative practitioners. And when I discovered that there were thousands of surviving articles of Kibbo Kift kit, mostly never exhibited or published, I determined to retell their story with art and design at the centre, alongside the pacifist and anti-capitalist messages so pertinent to our own times. Kibbo Kift designed all elements of a retro-futurist utopia that never came to pass, so I revisited their ambitions for new audiences. Members were certain that they would be leaders of the new world emerging from the ashes of the war-torn old world. As such, they documented everything they did with a heroic sense of significance. And they claimed, I quote, "Logbooks and archives, apart from constituting a source of delight to the kinsfolk themselves, will be of enormous interest to the archaeologists and historians of the future. So it behoves our scribes to diligently compile copious records of the methods and the activities of the kindred." So I was again that future historian, but this time I was faced not only with abundant photographs, but also illuminated manuscripts, appliqued banners, and embroidered robes. Kibbo Kift encouraged all members to act as living propaganda. The clothes they wore and the flags they waved were central to their message. They were designed to embody belief, to attract attention and to ignite curiosity, to start the conversations that would reveal the organisation's objectives in pacifism, natural health, egalitarian economics, and the restoration of spiritual values to a material age. All Kibbo Kift culture, however cryptically, visualised the world they wished to bring into being, and a good example is the herald surcoat. This is one garment seen in front and back view, with its symbols of peace, place, and life. So it has burying the hatchet, the medieval Mappa Mundi, the map of the world, the splitting of cells in the act of creation, and the tree of life, as well as the red ellipsis representing the parted lips, which was to signal the role of the wearer, the herald who made announcements in Kibbo Kift camps. Symbolism infused all aspects of Kibbo Kift's culture, even their most practical gear. Symbols were used because of their relation to ancient communication forms, but their graphic lexicon also used a modernist language of pictograms, ideographs, and logos, alongside influences from Cubist, Constructivist, and Vorticist art movements, with further devices employed from heraldry and hermeticism. Their eclecticism made their messages hard to decipher, but I brought tools from design history, as well as knowledge of cosmic symbolism acquired in my former life, living with witches and wizards and weirdos in New Age traveller camps in the West Country 30 years ago. I wasn't always a respectable prof. So Kibokif's story had not been told before through objects and images, and these objects and images have gone on to have resonant afterlives. My book, and especially my exhibition, reached a new generation of creative practitioners who have found inspiration in Kibokif's utopianism, and especially in the style in which they delivered their message. So new Kibokif fashion collections have been launched, for example, Sadie Williams here, London Fashion Week in 2018. And new music has been created in the form of Albion's Beautiful Barbarians, new songs for the kindred spirit of Kibokif, released in 2024. Highly recommend listening to this on Spotify. And I wrote the liner notes, which is probably a highlight of my career. And so others were inspired by Kibokif, and I was inspired by that research to take some new directions of my own. For as I read Kibokif's philosophies, I discovered one that was new to me, gymnosophy. In the 1920s, its practitioners asked the public, do you ever have a sense that something is lacking, a vague sense of complete happiness never quite achieved? If so, the solution they offered was to take one's clothes off socially. Gymnosophy combined the Greek words for nakedness and wisdom. Gymnosophists, who were artists, writers, doctors and psychiatrists, were the first British proponents of the modern social movement that would become nudism. The practice, they promised, offered physical, moral and spiritual comfort to all, and the ability to unite all sects and denominations in one brotherhood. Our clothes lie behind us, gymnosophists proclaimed. In the garb of nature, we address you. We are facing the light, naked and unashamed. The hardy British intellectuals who established a national nudist movement did so under very hostile conditions, a cold climate in both temperature and temperament. The future they imagined was very far from the one they inhabited. When the Gymnosophy Society placed invitations to join their camps in the 1920s pages of Health and Efficiency magazine, they had to blur their focus. They described their gatherings as places where a group of congenial persons, united in a desire to detach themselves from the trivialities and less valuable artificialities of conventional existence, may find opportunity for vigorous, healthy exercise and stimulating thinking, for vitalising recreation and refreshing social intercourse. They were also gathering to undress, but in buttoned-up times, this could barely be mentioned. Secrecy was paramount. The first British gymnosophists, around 10 male and female journalists and sociologists, free thinkers and health enthusiasts, concealed their identities behind fanciful alter egos such as Zex and Thwang. In 1920s Britain, taking your clothes off in public, even in screened-off places, was viewed with great suspicion. When the New Health Society, for example, sunbathed nude and partially dressed on private land in Hendon in 1929, they were attacked in violent clashes described by the press as a sunbathing war. Passers-by accused them of being sexual maniacs. Members were arrested for indecency and they were threatened with imprisonment. As nudism gained prominence in the 1930s, new magazines sprang up to serve the cause, and these established a core set of visual representations, including photos of practitioners, but also models who were said to provide examples to aspire to. Poses ranged from the gymnastic to the classical, but all had to deal with a key challenge. The depiction of genitals and pubic hair was considered obscene under British law and could lead to imprisonment. This led to a sameness of imagery with backs turned to the camera, limbs discreetly raised, or strategically placed props. Some established photographers, including royal portraitist Bertram Park, who photographed King Charles as a baby, adapted their style to become leading nudist magazine contributors. But there was a conflict between the philosophies of the articles, championing truth and freedom from shame, and the need for the photos to pass the censor. The history of British nudism is partly a history of British law. It's of the battles fought to show full naked bodies, and not just any body. It was usually a slim young white woman. Nudists had skin in the game, but so did artists and so did pornographers. The different ways that nude photos could be interpreted depending on the photographer's style, the place and format of publication, the framing, the lighting, the captioning, constituted the legal difference between art and obscenity, between elite consecration and a prison cell. There were soapbox trials throughout the 1950s and 60s as photographers such as Roy, who I'm showing you here, campaigned against the legal need to obscure the pubic area. And most of those battles were won by the 1970s, which saw the nude photo become ubiquitous in commercial culture, much to the disappointment of many nudists who felt their lofty health ideals had been debased. When I wrote my book on the subject, I ended in the early 1970s, but the war over the visibility of nude bodies rages on, now on social media, where nudists cannot represent themselves and where body parts that were publishable in the censorious 1950s, breasts and buttocks, for example, are now vetoed, regardless of any educational, artistic, or protest contexts. And this has repercussions for me because I cannot show illustrations from my book on Instagram, and nor can I sell my book on Amazon without a modesty flap. The publishers designed one in very cleverly in the style of those that had been used in mid-century. Campaigns for bodily freedom and gender equality, such as Free the Nipple, have energised these debates, as have recent attention-grabbing campaigns by art galleries who open OnlyFans accounts to enable them to show the nude statuary and painting that is banned on mainstream social media. And for the last part of my lecture, I'd like to reflect on some themes from my most recent book, which examines how art has been used for international cultural relations through the British Council, which is the UK's principal body for such work. Unlike some of my other projects which have examined visual and material culture that has not been taken seriously, this commissioned history engages with a major collection of 9,000 artworks by some of the biggest names in modern and contemporary art, as illustrated in this banner and the next by Ed Hall. Akin to some of my other studies, this book asks, what do people expect art to do? How does the meaning of images and objects change depending on who is looking, where and when? It examines too changing notions of national identity and how these are visualised, mobilised and contested in state-funded exhibitions of British art on the international stage. My book covers the British Council's 90-year history, beginning with its establishment in 1934, its development of a fine art department, its first art purchases, and its first art exhibitions. And I'm going to offer you a taster of images and objects in action. I'm going to tell you two quick exhibition stories, 75 years apart. So in 1942, during the Battle of the Atlantic, across waters riddled with U-boats, the British Council sent 6 tons of handmade objects to the exhibition of modern British crafts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. Teapots and table mats, corn dollies and cushion covers travelled 3,500 miles by sea and then around 15 cities across the US and Canada, and later Australia and New Zealand. Under conditions of total war, what could a craft exhibition achieve? Against the machinery of modern conflict in life or death situations, its objects could appear trivial. And yet the British Council invested significant effort in the project, supported by King George VI, who provided the Royal Library at Windsor Castle as a space to assemble exhibits when London was under the Blitz. All recognised that craft's embodiment of the domestic and the local could carry emotive messages about British identity that might win the hearts and maintain the loyalty of wartime allies overseas. The exhibition was a product of conditions of peculiar difficulty, its organisers said. Everyone who uses his hands or hers, they said, is using them for another purpose. Silk means parachutes, not embroidery. The guns can spare no iron, and the potteries are too busy with insulators to supply decorative tea services. A quotation from Ecclesiasticus praised makers. They shall not be sought for public counsel, nor sit high in the congregation, but they will maintain the state of the world, it said. And those who would maintain the broken wartime world included weavers, potters, book illustrators, wallpaper printers, silversmiths, and glassblowers. The New York show featured staged rooms with tables laid for dinner. Every item, from the paper on the walls to the rugs on the floor, was an exhibit. By 1942, the British Council had been curating exhibitions for several years. What made this show valuable, its organisers claimed, was its appeal to a much wider range, a much wider cross-section of the public than those reached by exhibitions of paintings. The exhibits and their display avoided, they said, the barrier of strangeness that many feel in regard to modern painting, and a collection of this kind, they said, is closely related to the daily life of visitors of all sorts. Attendees included craftspeople, occupational therapists and their patients, women's groups and school children. They handled exhibits in ways that were not normally possible in galleries, so textiles were turned over, cabinet drawers were opened. The displayed ceramics were even used to sup tea. This human element was designed to reach, they said, people who now have boys in Britain and who felt the show to be a link with them. What Winston Churchill would later call the special relationship between Britain and the US was enacted as a family meal around a dining table. Cushions and tea softened and smoothed a strategic alliance. As the director of one host museum said of this object lesson, it is much more valuable than any direct form of propaganda. 75 years after the British Council sent teapots and table mats 3,500 miles to the US, they shipped embroidered underpants, false nails and plastic turds 5,500 miles to South Korea. Jeremy Deller and Alan Kane's folk archive, comprising 300 items from joke shop displays and prisoners' drawings to trade union banners and nail art, is an anarchic record of everyday creativity in Britain, originally compiled in counterpoint to the idealised vision of the nation that the artist feared was going to populate the Millennium Dome. This collection is now owned by the British Council, and in 2017 it appeared in an exhibition dedicated to protest at Seoul Museum of Art. Art that carried political messages had long been avoided by the British Council. It was deemed too propagandistic, and it thus smacked of totalitarian regimes. And it made culture political, and the British Council has always insisted that art occupies a space apart. The art of dissonance, however, displayed the visual culture of activism, and it embraced art's political role. The message resonated in an exhibition 30 miles from the border with North Korea, who tested a hydrogen bomb in the same month the show opened. Its purpose was to celebrate artistic critique and people power in mocking traditions and questioning authority. these were the cultural values that the floral wrestlers and burr-covered effigies elliptically hoped to spread. So objects and images, whether domestic crafts or fine art, have personal and political potential. They can be sites of profound engagement, but they are also slippery containers of meaning. Their significance can be complex and ambiguous. Their messages can clarify, but they can also complicate. And these are precisely the tensions that keep me fascinated. There is always more to see, to feel, and to say. So thank you for travelling with me through the years as I've led you down some curious alleyways and perhaps introduced you to some material that may seem marginal. Thank you too to my senior university colleagues. My promotion to professor in 2022, I think, was an endorsement that these things matter. And the work continues. I've just written a new book. Ask me about it over a drink, please. So thank you again for your attention and support.